A week before my daughter's wedding, I found a message on my future son-in-law's phone that froze my blood. I made sure the wedding was canceled. A day later, the groom showed up at my door threatening me. I smiled and said, "Turn around." Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought I'd be the kind of father who went through someone's phone. At 61, I believed in trust, in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes life forces you into corners you never imagined you'd find yourself in. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week before Aurora's wedding. The house buzzed with last-minute preparations, caterers calling, florists delivering samples, and my daughter Aurora floating around in a state of pure joy that I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. Gary, her fiancé, had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he stepped outside to take a business call. I was cleaning up dinner dishes when the phone lit up with a message notification. Normally, I would have ignored it completely, but something made me glance down, and what I saw made my blood turn cold. The message preview showed just enough to destroy everything. "Can't wait to get my hands on that inheritance money. This wedding is going to be the best investment I ever made." My hands trembled as I stood there, dish towel still in my grip. The phone buzzed again. Another message from the same contact, someone named Marcus. "You sure she doesn't suspect anything? Rich girls can be smarter than they look." I felt like I was drowning in my own kitchen. 28 years of raising Aurora as a single father flashed before my eyes. Her mother had died when she was just 3, and I'd devoted my entire life to making sure she never felt that loss too deeply. I'd worked 3 jobs to put her through private school, saved every penny for her college education, and built a successful accounting firm that would one day be hers. The phone buzzed a 3rd time. Gary's response, "She's completely clueless. Thinks I love her for her personality. The poor thing actually believes someone could fall for a boring accountant like her. Once we're married and I get access to the business accounts, I'll give it 6 months before I disappear with everything." I set down the dish towel with shaking hands. The Gary I thought I knew, the charming, attentive man who had swept my daughter off her feet 8 months ago, was a complete fabrication. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every moment he'd spent earning my trust had been an elaborate lie. What destroyed me most wasn't just the money. Aurora had always been self-conscious about her quiet nature, her preference for books over parties, her genuine sweetness that made her trust people too easily. She'd told me just last week how grateful she was that Gary loved her exactly as she was. She'd said she finally felt beautiful, finally felt worthy of real love. Gary came back inside, still talking on his phone about construction schedules. He was a project manager for a development company, or so he'd told us. Looking at him now, I wondered what else was a lie. He hung up and walked over to where I stood. "Thanks for watching my phone, Chris," he said with that easy smile that had fooled us all. "Hope it wasn't buzzing too much. Work never stops, you know." I handed him the phone, managing to keep my expression neutral. "No problem at all." Aurora bounced into the kitchen at that moment, her arms full of wedding favor samples. "Dad, what do you think of these?" She held up small boxes of chocolates, her eyes bright with excitement. Gary picked them out. He says they remind him of our first date when we shared dessert at that little cafe downtown. I looked at my daughter's glowing face, then at Gary's perfectly practiced expression of adoration, and felt something break inside my chest. She had no idea she was marrying a predator. "They're lovely, sweetheart," I managed to say. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my study, staring at the wedding guest list that Aurora had spent weeks perfecting. 200 people were coming to celebrate what they thought was a love story. The venue was booked, the dress was altered, the flowers were ordered. In 7 days, I was supposed to walk my only child down the aisle and hand her over to a man who planned to destroy her. I thought about confronting Gary directly, but I knew he'd find a way to turn it around. Men like him always did. He'd probably claim someone had hacked his phone or that the messages were taken out of context. Aurora was so deeply in love that she'd believe him over me. I thought about showing Aurora the messages, but I knew it would devastate her in ways that might never heal. She'd been through enough heartbreak for one lifetime. By morning, I'd made my decision. I couldn't let this wedding happen, no matter the cost. But I also couldn't destroy my daughter's faith in love itself. I needed to find another way to protect her, even if it meant she'd hate me for it. The next few days passed in a blur of wedding preparations that felt more like planning a funeral. Every smile Aurora gave Gary, every grateful hug she gave me for being the best father in the world, every excited call to her friends about her perfect wedding made my heart ache more. Friday morning, 2 days before the ceremony, I made the call that would change everything. "Aurora, sweetheart, we need to talk." "You've lost your mind, Dad. Completely lost your mind." Aurora stood in our living room, her wedding dress hanging behind her in its protective bag, her face twisted with a pain I'd never seen before. I'd just told her the wedding was off, that I'd already called the venue and the caterers. I hadn't told her why. "I know this is hard to understand," I said, my voice as steady as I could manage, "but I need you to trust me. This isn't the right decision for you." Trust you?" Her voice cracked. "Dad, I'm 26 years old. I don't need you to make my decisions for me anymore." Gary sat on the couch beside her, his arm around her shoulders in what looked like comfort, but felt like possession to me now. He'd been quiet since I'd made the announcement, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was trying to figure out what I knew and how to regain control. "Mr. Wellington," Gary said, his voice carefully measured. "I think you're having pre-wedding jitters. It's completely normal for fathers to feel protective when their daughters get married. But Aurora and I love each other. We've planned this day for months." I looked at him and felt nothing but disgust. "The wedding is not happening, Gary. I've already spoken to Father Martinez at the church. The venue is canceled, the caterers are canceled. Everything is canceled." Aurora shot to her feet. "You can't just cancel my wedding. It's my life, my choice, my money, paying for half of it." "Actually," I said quietly, "I paid for all of it. And as the person financially responsible for this event, I have every right to cancel it." The look on her face nearly broke me. Aurora had never looked at me with anything but love and respect before this moment. Now she stared at me like I was a stranger who'd just slapped her. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered. "I thought you liked Gary. I thought you approved of us." "I thought I did too," I said, the words heavier than I'd expected. Gary stood up, his facade of calm starting to crack. "This is ridiculous. You can't just destroy people's lives because you have some kind of midlife crisis. Aurora, we can still have the wedding. We'll pay for it ourselves. Find another venue. Make it work." I watched him carefully. A man who genuinely loved my daughter would be asking why I was so opposed to the marriage. He'd want to understand my concerns, address them, prove me wrong. Instead, Gary was focused solely on making sure the wedding happened, no matter what. "Gary," I said, "why don't you seem curious about my reasons?" "Because your reasons don't matter," he snapped. And there it was, the real Gary finally showing through. "Aurora is an adult. She can marry whoever she wants." Aurora was crying now, quiet tears that made my chest ache. "Dad, please, I love him. He loves me. Isn't that enough?" I walked over to her and gently took her hands. They were so small, just like when she was little and I'd hold them while crossing the street. "Sweetheart, love should be enough. But sometimes the people we love aren't who we think they are." "What does that mean?" she asked. I couldn't tell her about the messages. Not yet. Not until I had more proof, more protection for her. "It means I need you to trust me just this once. Can you do that?" She pulled her hands away. "No, I can't. You're asking me to throw away my happiness based on nothing but your feelings. That's not fair, and it's not right." Gary moved closer to Aurora, his hand finding her back. "Baby, we don't need his approval. We can go to the courthouse tomorrow, get married there, start our life together like we planned." "Don't," I said, the word coming out sharper than I intended. "Don't pressure her when she's upset." "I'm not pressuring anyone," Gary said, but his eyes were cold now. "I'm supporting my fiancé while her father tries to ruin the most important day of her life." Aurora looked between us, confusion and pain written across her face. "I need some air," she said finally. "This is all too much." She walked out the front door, leaving Gary and me alone in the living room. The silence stretched between us until Gary finally spoke. "What's your game here, old man?" The mask was completely off now. The charming, respectful future son-in-law had vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I don't know what you mean," I said. Gary stepped closer. "Aurora's going to marry me whether you like it or not, and when she does, I'm going to make sure she knows exactly what kind of controlling, manipulative father you really are. You'll be lucky if she speaks to you once a year." I met his stare without flinching. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," he said. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The next morning, Saturday, Aurora wasn't speaking to me. She'd spent the night at her friend Jessica's house and sent me a text saying she needed space to think. Gary, meanwhile, had been calling and texting me all night, his messages growing increasingly aggressive. I spent the day making phone calls I never thought I'd have to make, explaining to confused relatives why the wedding was suddenly off, dealing with vendors who wanted cancellation fees, listening to my sister Margaret lecture me about how I was destroying Aurora's happiness. "You're making a terrible mistake, Christopher," Margaret said during our third phone call of the day. "That girl has been planning this wedding since she was 5 years old. You're breaking her heart." "I'm trying to save her life," I said, but I couldn't explain how or why. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling. What should have been Aurora's wedding day felt like a funeral instead. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and wondering if I'd made the right choice. Maybe I should have found another way. Maybe I should have trusted Aurora to see through Gary's lies eventually. Then I heard the pounding on my front door. I opened it to find Gary standing on my porch, his hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. His eyes were bloodshot and furious. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Everything I worked for, everything I planned. Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" "I have a pretty good idea," I said calmly. He pushed past me into the house without being invited. "Aurora won't even take my calls now. She says she needs time to think about whether she can trust someone her father disapproves of so strongly. You poisoned her against me. I haven't said anything negative about you to Aurora. You didn't have to. You just destroyed our wedding and let her imagination fill in the blanks." He turned to face me, his hands clenched into fists. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to call her right now and tell her you made a mistake. You're going to apologize and help us plan a new wedding, because if you don't, I'm going to make your life a living hell." I looked at this man who'd been sitting at my dinner table for months, who'd pretended to care about my daughter, who'd made me believe he was worthy of the most precious thing in my world. "No," I said simply. Gary's face flushed red. "You don't understand. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Fix this, or I will destroy you and your precious daughter both." I smiled then, which seemed to surprise him. "Gary," I said quietly, "I think you should look behind you." Gary turned around slowly, and I watched the color drain from his face as he saw the two men standing in my doorway. Detective Martinez, a heavy-set man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward first. Behind him stood David Chen, the private investigator I'd hired 3 days ago. "Gary Mitchell," Detective Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We need to talk." Gary's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked back at me, then at the men in the doorway, his bravado evaporating completely. "I don't understand," Gary stammered. "Who are these people? What's going on?" "These gentlemen have some very interesting information about you," I said, crossing my arms. "Information I think Aurora should know before she makes any permanent decisions about her future." David Chen stepped forward, pulling a thick manila folder from his briefcase. "Mr. Mitchell, or should I say, Mr. Gary Patterson? Or perhaps you prefer Gary Stevens. It's hard to keep track of all your identities." I watched Gary's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally, pure panic. He took a step backward, bumping into my coffee table. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Gary said, but his voice had lost all its earlier aggression. Detective Martinez pulled out a small notebook. "Gary Mitchell, 32 years old, originally from Phoenix, Arizona, except there's no record of a Gary Mitchell born 32 years ago in Phoenix. In fact, there's no record of Gary Mitchell existing anywhere until about 2 years ago." "That's impossible," Gary said weakly. David opened his folder and spread several photographs across my dining table. These are your marriage certificates, Gary, 3 of them to be exact. Sandra Patterson in Las Vegas, Nevada 4 years ago. Maria Stevens in Tucson, Arizona 2 years ago. And Janet Mitchell in San Diego, California 18 months ago. My stomach turned as I looked at the documents. 3 women, all around Aurora's age, all smiling radiantly next to the man I'd almost let marry my daughter. None of these marriages were ever legally dissolved, Detective Martinez added. Which makes you a bigamist, Mr. Mitchell. A federal crime. Gary was backing toward my front door now, his eyes darting between the exit and the evidence spread across my table. This is all a misunderstanding. Those women, they knew what they were getting into. Those weren't real marriages. Really? David pulled out another set of documents. Because according to Sandra Patterson's bank records, you cleaned out her savings account 2 weeks after the wedding, $47,000 to be exact. She filed a police report, but you'd already disappeared. And Maria Stevens, Detective Martinez continued, lost her inheritance from her grandmother. $63,000 that she'd been saving to buy a house. You convinced her to put it in a joint account for your future together, and vanished the next day. I felt sick listening to this litany of destruction. These weren't just financial crimes. They were emotional devastation, trust shattered, lives ruined. And I'd almost let this monster get his hands on Aurora. Janet Mitchell was the smartest one, David said with grim satisfaction. She got suspicious when you started asking about her family's assets. She hired a private investigator, me, actually, and discovered your real identity before you could disappear with her money. Gary's back hit my front door. This is harassment. You can't prove any of this. Actually, we can, Detective Martinez said. We have bank records, witness statements, and most importantly, we have Janet. She's been working with us for months to track you down. I stepped closer to Gary, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. 3 women, Gary, 3 families destroyed by your lies, and you almost made it 4. Aurora is different, Gary said desperately. I really do love her. She's not like the others. You're right, I said. She's not like the others, because she has a father who loves her enough to protect her from predators like you. David pulled out his phone and showed Gary the screen. This is a recording of your conversation with your friend Marcus 3 days ago, the one where you discussed your timeline for accessing Aurora's trust fund and disappearing with the money from my client's business. Gary stared at the phone, his face going completely white. How did you... Janet Mitchell wasn't your only mistake, Detective Martinez said. You've been sloppy, Gary. Using the same phone number across multiple identities, staying in touch with the same criminal contacts, following the same pattern of behavior. We've been building a case against you for 8 months. I thought about Aurora, probably sitting at Jessica's house wondering why her father had destroyed her perfect wedding day. She had no idea how close she'd come to losing everything, her money, her business, her faith in love itself. The wedding was scheduled for today, I said to Gary. You were going to marry her this afternoon, wait exactly 6 months like you told Marcus, then disappear with everything she had. Gary slumped against the door, the fight going out of him completely. She would have been fine. I wasn't going to hurt her physically. I would have just moved on. Just moved on? I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. You would have destroyed my daughter's heart, stolen her inheritance, bankrupted the business I spent 30 years building, and you think that's not hurting her? Detective Martinez moved forward with handcuffs. Gary Mitchell, or whatever your real name is, you're under arrest for bigamy, wire fraud, and theft. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read Gary his rights, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over me. For 3 days I'd been carrying the weight of this secret, wondering if I was making the right choice, terrified that I might be destroying Aurora's happiness for nothing. Now I knew I'd saved her from something far worse than a broken engagement. David Chen closed his folder and looked at me. We'll need Aurora to give a statement about any financial information she might have shared with him. Bank account numbers, business details, anything that could help us understand the full scope of what he was planning. I nodded. She'll cooperate once she understands what really happened. As they led Gary away in handcuffs, He looked back at me one last time. The charming facade was completely gone now, replaced by something cold and calculating that made my skin crawl. "He'll never forgive you for this," he said. "Aurora will always wonder if you destroyed her only chance at real love." I met his stare without flinching. "No, Gary. I saved her from someone who never loved her at all." After they left, I stood in my empty house looking at the evidence scattered across my dining table. Photos of Gary's other victims, bank records, police reports, marriage certificates, the paper trail of a predator who'd made a career out of destroying women's lives. Now I had to figure out how to tell Aurora the truth without destroying her faith in love completely. Because despite everything Gary had put us through, I still believed my daughter deserved to find real happiness with someone who would treasure her the way she deserved to be treasured. Aurora arrived at my house 3 hours later, her eyes red from crying and her voice hoarse from what I imagined had been hours of questioning everything she thought she knew about her life. "Jessica said you called," she said, standing in my doorway like she wasn't sure she wanted to come inside. "She said it was urgent." I'd spent those 3 hours cleaning up the evidence from my dining table and trying to figure out how to explain everything without completely shattering my daughter's world. But looking at her face now, puffy from tears and tight with exhaustion, I realized there was no gentle way to do this. "Come sit down, sweetheart," I said. "We need to talk." She followed me into the living room, but didn't sit. Instead, she stood by the window, arms crossed, looking everywhere except at me. "If you're going to lecture me about trusting your judgment, I don't want to hear it," she said. "I'm still angry with you, Dad. What you did was cruel and embarrassing, and I don't understand why you couldn't just tell me what was bothering you about Gary, instead of destroying everything." I pulled out my phone and set it on the coffee table between us. "I'm going to play you something, Aurora. But before I do, I need you to know that I love you more than my own life, and everything I did was to protect you." She finally looked at me, confusion replacing some of the anger in her eyes. "Protect me from what?" I pressed play on the recording David had made of Gary's phone conversation with Marcus. Gary's voice filled the room, casual and cruel, as he discussed his plan to marry Aurora for her money and disappear within 6 months. I watched my daughter's face as she listened to the man she loved call her boring, gullible, and stupid. I saw the exact moment her heart broke, not just the disappointment of a broken engagement, but the devastating realization that someone she trusted completely had been lying to her about everything. When the recording ended, Aurora sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face. "That's not all," I said gently. I pulled out the folder David had left with me and spread the marriage certificates across the coffee table. "Gary's real name isn't Gary Mitchell. He's been married 3 times before, never divorced any of those women, and he's stolen money from all of them." Aurora's hands dropped from her face. She stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. "3 wives," she whispered. "He's married to 3 other women?" "4, if he had succeeded in marrying you today," I said. "The police arrested him this morning. He's being charged with bigamy and fraud." She picked up one of the marriage certificates with trembling fingers. The photo showed Gary in a different suit, smiling next to a blonde woman who looked heartbreakingly young and happy. "Sandra Patterson," Aurora read aloud. "She looks like she's my age." She was 25 when Gary married her. He convinced her to put her entire savings account in his name and then disappeared 2 weeks later. She lost $47,000 and had to move back in with her parents. Aurora set the certificate down and picked up another one. "Maria Stevens, 26. Her voice was getting smaller with each word. "Janet Mitchell, 24. All of them thought they were Gary's only love," I said. "All of them trusted him completely, just like you did." She was quiet for a long time, studying the photos and documents spread across the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "How long have you known?" "I found out Tuesday night when I saw messages on his phone. I hired a private investigator immediately. David Chen is the same investigator Janet Mitchell used to expose Gary before he could steal from her too." Aurora looked up at me, tears starting to fall again. "You knew for almost a week, and you didn't tell me?" "I wanted to protect you from this pain," I said. "I thought if I could just stop the wedding without you having to know the details, Maybe you could move on without having your faith in people completely destroyed. But I had a right to know, she said. I had a right to understand why my own father was sabotaging my wedding. She was right, and I knew it. I'd made the choice I thought would hurt her least, but I'd also taken away her agency in the process. You're absolutely right, I said. I should have told you immediately. I was trying to be your protector instead of treating you like the intelligent, capable woman you are. Aurora wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Did you really cancel everything? The venue, the caterers, all of it? Everything. I told them there was a family emergency. Good, she said, and her voice was stronger now, because the thought of him walking into our wedding, looking at all our friends and family, planning to steal from us the whole time, she shuddered. It makes me sick. I moved to sit beside her on the couch. Sweetheart, I need you to know that none of this is your fault. Gary is a professional con artist. He spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate women exactly like this. I feel so stupid, she said. All those things he said about loving my personality, about how refreshing it was to meet someone genuine and kind. It was all just him studying me, figuring out what I wanted to hear. You're not stupid for wanting to be loved, I said. You're not stupid for trusting someone you cared about. Gary is a predator who targeted you specifically because you're successful and kind-hearted. He picked up another document from the pile, a bank statement showing how Gary had drained Sandra Patterson's savings account. He asked me about the business last month, Aurora said slowly, about how the accounts were structured, who had access to what. I thought he was just taking an interest in my work. My blood ran cold. What did you tell him? Everything, she whispered. I showed him the books, explained how Dad taught me to manage the finances, told him about my trust fund, and when I'd get full access to it. She looked at me with wide, horrified eyes. I gave him a complete roadmap for how to steal everything we have. I took her hand. But he didn't get it. That's what matters. We stopped him before he could take anything from you. Aurora was quiet again, processing everything. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Dad, how do I ever trust anyone again? How do I know if someone really loves me or if they're just like Gary? I squeezed her hand. You learn to trust yourself first. You learn to listen to your instincts. And you remember that real love doesn't rush you, doesn't pressure you, and doesn't make you feel like you have to prove your worth. She leaned against my shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. I was going to marry him today. I was going to promise to love him forever. But you didn't, I said. And now you're free to find someone who actually deserves that promise. We sat together in silence for a while, surrounded by the evidence of Gary's deception. Finally, Aurora spoke again. I owe you an apology, Dad, and a thank you. I was so angry with you for canceling the wedding, but you saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. You don't owe me anything, I said. I'm just grateful we caught him before it was too late. She sat up and started gathering the documents into a neat pile. Detective Martinez said, they need me to give a statement about what information I shared with Gary. Yes, but only when you're ready. There's no rush. Aurora stood up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked like my strong, determined daughter again, instead of a broken-hearted victim. I'm ready now, she said. I want to make sure Gary can never do this to anyone else. The police station felt sterile and intimidating as Aurora and I walked through its corridors 3 days later. Detective Martinez had called to tell us that Gary's arraignment was scheduled for that afternoon, and they needed Aurora's official statement before the hearing. I watched my daughter as she sat across from Detective Martinez, her back straight and her voice steady, as she detailed every conversation she'd had with Gary about our family's finances. She'd spent the last 3 days processing her emotions, and I was amazed by her strength. He asked me about the business structure during our third date, Aurora said, consulting the notes she'd prepared. I thought it was sweet that he wanted to understand my work. He seemed so interested in how Dad had built the company from nothing. Detective Martinez nodded, taking careful notes. Did he ask about specific account numbers or access codes? Not directly, but he was very curious about how I managed the day-to-day finances. He asked if I handled everything myself, or if we had an accounting firm. When I told him I had full access to all the business accounts, he seemed really impressed. Aurora's voice tightened. He said it showed how much Dad trusted me. I felt a familiar surge of anger at how Gary had twisted my pride in Aurora's capabilities into a weapon against us. Every conversation, every shared moment had been calculated manipulation. "What about your personal finances?" Detective Martinez asked gently. "Did you discuss your trust fund or inheritance?" Aurora nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I told him about the trust fund my mom left me. I get full access when I turn 30, but I already receive monthly distributions." He asked how much it was worth, and I told him. $250,000. Detective Martinez wrote this down carefully. "Did he ever suggest combining your finances or putting money into joint accounts?" "Not yet, but I think he was building up to it. About a month ago, he started talking about our future together, about how married couples should share everything. He said he wanted us to be completely transparent with each other financially." Aurora looked at me. "I was actually planning to add him to my checking account after the wedding as a gesture of trust." My stomach turned. If I hadn't found those messages, Gary would have had access to Aurora's money within days of their marriage. He could have cleaned out her accounts and disappeared before she even realized what was happening. "Miss Wellington," Detective Martinez said, "I want you to know how brave you're being by coming forward with this information. Your testimony is going to be crucial in making sure Gary can't hurt anyone else." After we finished at the police station, Aurora and I drove to the courthouse for Gary's arraignment. I hadn't wanted her to attend, but she insisted she needed to see him face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom was small and cramped, nothing like the dramatic courtrooms you see on television. Gary sat at the defendant's table with a court-appointed attorney, his expensive suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and more pathetic than I remembered. When the judge read the charges against him, 3 counts of bigamy, 4 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of theft, Gary's shoulders slumped forward. The cocky, charming man who'd threatened me in my living room was gone, replaced by someone who looked defeated and scared. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, "how do you plead to these charges?" Gary's attorney whispered something in his ear, and Gary stood up slowly. "Not guilty, Your Honor." I felt Aurora tense beside me. She'd been hoping he would plead guilty, take responsibility for what he'd done, show some remorse for the women he'd hurt. His not guilty plea meant this ordeal would drag on for months. "Bail is set at $50,000, the judge announced. "The defendant will surrender his passport and remain in the county pending trial." As we left the courthouse, Aurora was quiet and thoughtful. Finally she spoke. "He's going to fight this, isn't he? He's going to put all those women through the trauma of testifying, make them relive what he did to them." "Probably," I said. "But Aurora, you don't have to be part of that if you don't want to be. You were never legally married to him, and he didn't actually steal any money from you. You could walk away from all this right now." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "No, Dad, I can't walk away. Sandra lost her entire savings because of him. Maria lost her grandmother's inheritance. If my testimony helps put him in prison so he can't do this to anyone else, then I have to testify." That evening, back at home, Aurora sat at her laptop researching Gary's other victims. She'd found Sandra Patterson's social media account and was reading through posts from 4 years ago after Gary had disappeared with her money. "Look at this," Aurora said, showing me Sandra's Facebook page. She wrote about having to move back in with her parents, about not being able to trust men anymore, about feeling stupid and worthless because she'd been so easily fooled. I read the posts over Aurora's shoulder, my heart aching for this young woman I'd never met. Sandra had written about the shame of having to explain to friends and family that her new husband had vanished with all her money. She'd written about panic attacks and sleepless nights, about wondering if she'd ever be able to believe someone loved her again. "This could have been me," Aurora said quietly. "If you hadn't found those messages, this would have been my life. Broken, humiliated, financially ruined, afraid to trust anyone ever again." Over the following weeks, Aurora threw herself into helping with the case against Gary. She worked with Detective Martinez to piece together the timeline of Gary's relationship with her, identifying moments when he'd been gathering information about our family's wealth. She also reached out to Gary's other victims. Sandra Patterson lived in Phoenix now, working 2 jobs to rebuild her savings. Maria Stevens had moved back to her hometown in New Mexico and was seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma of Gary's betrayal. Janet Mitchell, the woman whose suspicions had led to Gary's capture, had become an advocate for fraud victims. They're all so much stronger than they realize, Aurora told me after a long phone conversation with Sandra. Gary took their money, but he didn't destroy their spirits. They're survivors. I watched my daughter during this time and marveled at how she was channeling her own pain into something purposeful. Instead of becoming bitter or withdrawn, she was using her experience to help other women who'd been hurt by the same predator. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Gary's arrest. Aurora, Sandra, Maria, and Janet would all testify about their experiences with Gary, and David Chen would present the evidence he'd gathered about Gary's pattern of fraud. The night before the hearing, Aurora and I sat in our living room, the same room where Gary had threatened me just weeks earlier. She was nervous about testifying, but determined. "Dad," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "Do you think I'll ever be able to trust someone enough to fall in love again? Really fall in love without constantly wondering if they're lying to me?" I thought about her question carefully. Aurora had been through something traumatic, and I knew the effects might last for years. But I also knew my daughter's strength, her capacity for growth and healing. "I think," I said finally, "that you'll be more careful next time, which isn't a bad thing. You'll trust your instincts more, ask harder questions, take things slower, and when you do find someone worthy of your love, it will be even more meaningful because you'll know the difference between real love and manipulation." She nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. "I keep thinking about what Gary said on that recording, about me being boring and gullible. What if that's actually true? What if there's something about me that makes me an easy target?" "Aurora," I said firmly, "the only thing about you that made you a target was your success and your kind heart. Gary specifically chose women who were financially stable and emotionally generous because those were the qualities he needed to exploit. Your kindness isn't a weakness. It's one of your greatest strengths." The next morning, as we prepared to leave for the courthouse, Aurora put on a navy blue suit and pulled her hair back in a professional bun. She looked composed and confident, nothing like the heartbroken woman who'd cried in my living room just weeks earlier. "Ready?" I asked. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready. Let's make sure Gary never gets the chance to do this to anyone else." 2 years later, I stood in the same church where Aurora's first wedding was supposed to take place, watching my daughter walk down the aisle toward a man who truly deserved her love. Gary had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud and bigamy. The trial had been difficult, but Aurora's testimony had been powerful and compelling. She'd helped secure justice not just for herself, but for Sandra, Maria, and the other women Gary had victimized. Now, as I watched Aurora approach the altar where Michael waited for her, I marveled at how much had changed. Michael was nothing like Gary. Where Gary had been smooth and charming, Michael was genuine and thoughtful. Where Gary had rushed Aurora into commitment, Michael had been patient, taking 2 years to truly know her before proposing. I'd met Michael 8 months after Gary's sentencing. Aurora had started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped fraud victims, and Michael was the attorney who ran the program. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than passionate declarations and grand romantic gestures. Michael had spent months earning not just Aurora's trust, but mine as well. He'd answered every question I'd asked about his background, his finances, his intentions. He'd understood that after what Aurora had been through, transparency wasn't just appreciated, it was required. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I whispered to Aurora as we reached the altar. She squeezed my arm and smiled. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." As I placed her hand in Michael's, I saw the way he looked at her, with genuine love, respect, and wonder. This was what I'd wanted for her all along, not the performance Gary had put on, but real love from someone who saw her true worth. "Take care of her," I said quietly to Michael. Always, he replied, and I believed him. The ceremony was small and intimate, just close family and friends. Aurora had chosen simplicity over spectacle this time, focusing on the commitment rather than the celebration. Her vows were heartfelt and honest, acknowledging the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Michael," she said, her voice steady and clear, "you taught me that love doesn't have to hurt. You showed me that real love is patient and kind, that it builds you up instead of tearing you down. You never made me feel like I had to prove my worth or earn your affection. With you, I learned to trust again, not just you, but myself." Michael's vows were equally moving. "Aurora, your strength inspires me every day. You took something terrible that happened to you and turned it into a way to help others. You faced the world with courage and compassion, and I'm honored to be the man you chose to share your life with." During the reception, I found myself talking with Sandra Patterson, who had flown in from Phoenix to attend the wedding. Over the past 2 years, she and Aurora had become close friends, bonded by their shared experience, but refusing to let it define them. "She's glowing," Sandra said, watching Aurora dance with Michael. "I'm so happy she found someone who appreciates what a gift she is." "How are you doing?" I asked Sandra. She'd been through therapy and had slowly rebuilt her life after Gary's theft, but I knew the healing process was ongoing. "I'm actually seeing someone," she said with a shy smile. "His name is David, and he's a teacher. Nothing fancy or exciting, but he's honest and kind, and he makes me laugh. We're taking things very slowly." "That sounds perfect," I said, and I meant it. Aurora had invited all of Gary's victims to the wedding, and most of them had come. Maria Stevens was there with her new boyfriend, a gentleman who worked at the animal shelter where she volunteered. Janet Mitchell had brought her fiancé, a police officer she'd met through the victim advocacy work she'd started after Gary's arrest. Seeing these women thriving, building new relationships based on trust and mutual respect, was perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole ordeal. Gary had tried to destroy their faith in love, but they'd all found ways to heal and open their hearts again. Late in the evening, as the reception was winding down, Aurora found me sitting at a table, watching the last few couples slow dancing. "Dad," she said, settling into the chair beside me, "I need to tell you something." I raised an eyebrow, noting the serious tone in her voice. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Gary, about the choices you made to protect me. I was angry with you at first for not telling me the truth immediately, for making decisions about my life without consulting me." I nodded. "You had every right to be angry. But I understand now why you did it. You weren't trying to control me. You were trying to save me from unnecessary pain. You could have just shown me those messages and let me deal with the fallout, but you took on the burden of protecting me, even knowing I might hate you for it." She reached over and took my hand. "That's what real love looks like, isn't it? Not the grand gestures and passionate declarations Gary used to manipulate me, but the quiet, selfless acts of someone who puts your well-being above their own comfort." I felt tears prick my eyes. "You would have figured it out eventually, you know. You're smarter and stronger than Gary ever gave you credit for." "Maybe," Aurora said, "but you made sure I didn't have to learn it the hard way. You saved me from years of heartbreak and financial ruin, and you did it at the cost of your own relationship with me. That's the most loving thing anyone has ever done for me." Michael appeared beside us, loosening his tie after a long day of celebration. "Mind if I interrupt this father-daughter moment?" "Never," Aurora said, reaching up to take his hand. "We were just talking about how grateful I am for the men in my life who actually love me." Michael squeezed her hand and looked at me. "Christopher, I know I've said this before, but thank you for raising such an incredible woman, and thank you for protecting her when she couldn't protect herself." As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey we'd all been on. 2 years ago, I'd been standing in my kitchen horrified by the messages on Gary's phone, knowing I had to destroy my daughter's happiness to save her future. I'd made that choice not knowing if Aurora would ever forgive me, not knowing if I was trading our relationship for her safety. But love had won in the end. Not the manipulative, self-serving love Gary had offered, but the real thing. Patient, protective, and ultimately healing. Aurora had found someone who cherished her authenticity rather than exploiting it. The other victims had rebuilt their lives and learned to trust again. And Gary was spending his days in a federal prison, unable to hurt anyone else. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house where Aurora had grown up. She'd moved in with Michael after their engagement, but she still came by every Sunday for dinner. She still called me when she needed advice or just wanted to talk. Our relationship had not only survived the ordeal with Gary, it had grown stronger. My phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. "Thank you for the best day of my life, Dad. See you Sunday for dinner. Love you." I typed back, "Love you too, sweetheart. Welcome to your new beginning." As I walked into my house, I felt a deep sense of peace. Sometimes protecting the people you love means making difficult choices, bearing uncomfortable burdens, and trusting that love will ultimately prevail. I'd been willing to sacrifice my relationship with Aurora to save her from Gary's deception, but in the end, truth and love had triumphed over manipulation and lies. Aurora was safe, happy, and loved by someone who truly deserved her. Gary's other victims had found healing and new hope, and I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is trust that the people you love are strong enough to handle the truth, even when it's painful. The nightmare was over, and Aurora's real life, her true love story, was just beginning.